So, something like that. This old Chinese fable is really kind of a funny little proverb and fable, too, that, we believe about the world with a bias. How do we really see the world? Do we really see the world with fresh eyes? What's really going on in this text that would have to do with how we see things? A friend of mine used to come over here every year for seminary week at Ministers Week. I wrote about this in the blog briefly, and I want to echo his sentiment here this morning. But he was a professor out at up in New York now in theology, and brilliant guy, and just spends hours and hours and hours of the week in the books studying. And he was a debate champion, so just an intimidating kind of presence. But he wasn't particularly athletic. Right, you would look at him and go, he's kind of a soft-looking kind of guy, and so every year he'd come back, because in college we played racquetball. So every year he'd come back, it's like, all right, we're going to have an afternoon, we're going to go to the Y, we're going to play racquetball, and every single time he just crushed me, he just beat me. And I don't exercise religiously, but I try to stay pretty active. And honestly, during the year, I don't do it now because of arthritis, but I would go and I'd play during the year to try to up my game. And I'm ready for him. And he would just soundly whip me into the ground, just beat me 2, 3, 4 games at racquetball. And then to rub it in, he'd step outside and he'd say, I don't know what's going on, man. I hadn't been playing all year. And, are you doing okay? And then he'd pull out of his pocket a cigarette and light it. And say, are you doing all right? How's your health? You just kind of rub it in. But then he was always this sort of a dichotomy, because then he'd throw out some philosophical quote, or he'd quote Thoreau, or he'd quote something else. And so he was typically asking me things like, it's the most important thing in the world. It's the greatest joy in the world. And I'm like, yeah, beating your good buddy at racquetball, right? Or maybe going and getting a burger with a beer. Maybe that's it. And he'd laugh and he'd say, no, the greatest joy is not being alone. Just out of nowhere. He'd bring it back, sort of ground it. The greatest joy is knowing that we're part of something. And then we go have lunch, and the conversation would leave the game entirely. There's something of that's happening in this verse. We tend to think of this verse as being all about, I just need to make sure that you're saved so you're going to heaven. So we need to go out and fish for people and get those people into heaven. We tend to think that way, and we fall back into these patterns. There's something much bigger happening here that has to do with how we learn to see. There's a question that came up after a performance I did down in near Austin this past week. Friday, I was at a school, and this was beautiful school out in the hill country outside of Austin, actually outside of Spicewood, if you know where that area is. And all elementary, so it's about 650 students. I've gotten to where I can walk into a school and tell what the school's going to be like if I've met the principal. I've got retired educators here. They know exactly what I'm talking about. I can look at the student body and tell what the principal's going to be like. Or I can meet the principal and know what the school experience is going to be like, and the teachers. And it all has to do with how they see things. Sometimes the principal's new, but if the teachers see a vision that's about the kids, that's about community, that's about working together, that principal's going to come on board. There's no other way they can do it. If the principal comes in with that vision, eventually that team's going to come on board. There's no other way you can do it if you're truly that inspired. And you can see it. So I happened to be doing a performance. It was a great group. They've never had an assembly before like this, especially 350 kids on the floor in the gym, worst possible place you can do a performance, right? And it's just noise and chaos, but they were so responsive and focused and paying attention and engaged, and even in critical thinking at levels where this stuff was pretty subtle. They were just right there. The teachers were surprised. Everybody was having such a great time. And I stopped at the second performance with mostly the older kids and about another 350, and I said, and I said that. I can tell what your principal's like. Well, she had come in the side door. I didn't know it, but she was standing off the side, and they kind of looked over, and I said, y'all must get along really well. And they kind of looked around and smiled, but it was that sort of like, how does he know that, And I said, now, maybe you didn't, but for some reason I get this feeling that y'all are working together. You've got you're sharing something here, and I just feel it. It's great. And then I left and went on to the next thing. And afterwards, the principal told me, she said, you know what? I don't think they would have seen that until somebody else reminded them. because the past year or so has been a horrible, terrible, difficult transition. And for the last 6 months, we've been working on being a team again, having a shared vision. And it's been working, but they're dealing with that old memory. And they can't see it. And until someone came in and suddenly said, I see something, they couldn't see it. And she said, and now I saw them smile at each other. It was just that reminder. It's hard to see things when we're living out of patterns, and we live out of patterns. Erich Fromm, the psychologist, said it's one of the greatest dangers of the human mind is the fact that we seek patterns. We want patterns. We want the familiar. So how do we try to see things strange? How do we try to see things in a new way? What was it that Yogi Berra said? I wanted to get that quote in here. I thought it was kind of... You observe a lot by watching. God bless you. Go on. See you. So, in reality, that seems obvious, doesn't it? But in reality, the scientists are saying, no, you don't. You can watch all you want. You're missing 75% or more. And in fact, you're even making up stuff that's not there. And you're going, Tom, you're crazy. But just do some research. It's fascinating to see where neuroscience is now. Our brain is so sophisticated, it's already acting without our volition. It's already moving without our willpower. It's already interpreting and making things up. And sometimes, unfortunately, it's going to the least path of resistance, or the path of least resistance, which means it may be going to the negative or the destructive. It may be going to the limited or inhibited, or it may be going to the positive and the hopeful and the possibilities. It kind of depends on a whole lot of factors. But the reality is that science is telling us our brains are doing a lot of stuff that we're not perceiving. There's a lot out there that we're not processing. So how do we get there? How do we begin to discover this way of seeing the world differently, of opening up? And unfortunately, when we live in a world like we live in, where things have become so polarized, and we react basically off of our basic sort of primitive instincts of fear and anxiety, flight and fight, then we're going to go to those familiar patterns. We're not even going to bother to second guess what we're thinking. And so you have these significant polarities that exist in not just in politics, but on all sorts of issues, social issues, moral issues. It's just black and white. There's hardly any openness in our country right now, in our culture, that says, I wonder, before anything else says, I wonder if I'm thinking about this wrong. That's so infrequently the first response, isn't it? I mean, if you're really honest with yourself, how many of us in here at the first debate or the first argument or the first sort of accusation or the first sort of threat of or discomfort, how many of us go, I wonder if it's me? I wonder if I'm thinking about this. Linda always says that when she's not in here, I talk about her a lot. She's just so easy to talk about. And really, we have this great sparring relationship. So I would say if she was here with me, she tells me when she was growing up, and her mom reminds me of this too. As a kid, she grew up with this sort of stubbornness. Her mom would always say, "You would argue with a fence post," right? And then as Linda grew up, she would say, "I'm German. I'm not going to argue if I'm not right. Why would I argue if I was wrong?" And I mean, it makes perfect sense. Some of us are really, really smart. I'm basically the person that starts off by saying, I'm Eeyore. That's who I've always been, Eeyore. There's something wrong with me. Okay, I'll go back and think again. But Linda's she's so disciplined with everything she does. And we know people like that, disciplined in their studies, disciplined in their approach to everything. They're not going to come up here until they've worked through this material 4, 5, 6 times, and then they've got it down. Then they're going to come. That's not me. Y'all already know that. But that's Linda. So why would I argue if I wasn't right or if I was wrong? Why would I argue? So there's this idea that we come to this sort of reality to our experiences a lot of times without this ability to think in terms of life's experiences as a mirror. But instead we think of life's experiences as an object in which we control or which we master. If life is sacred, if life is filled and imbued with God's presence and the mystery of God's wonder and this holiness, it's a little bit arrogant maybe, to approach daily that we're in control? Perhaps. And maybe that's what I really get out of this story, is that when Jesus gets in the boat and says, put your nets over here, they're all going like, we did that. There's nothing there. We've been there. And then Jesus says, try it again. Just, do it for me. Humor a guy, And they've already left the boats. They've already done, it's already defined, it's worthless. And they throw the nets in, and of course they pull up this abundance of fish. I'm of the school, like our friend Peter Mayer, the singer-songwriter, that great song, Everything is Holy Now, where he says the real miracle is not so much water into wine, but now the real miracle is looking at life and trying to find out where there isn't a miracle. That's the real wonder of life. But that's also the change in how you see things. Jesus says, throw the net over here. It's the water that you've been looking at this whole time. It's the life you've been living this whole time. You've already made up your mind. You've already decided. You could think about it. Just apply anything there. I'm an addict. I'm in a bad relation. I'm a failure. I can't succeed. We live in familiar patterns, negative or positive, that don't really see life as a mirror, but instead see life as we've already defined it. And that's the challenge, is how to see life strange. How to see it differently. And I don't have the one cure-all simple answer to that, but I do think it begins with a willingness to engage in some deep practices that start with this first question, which is, it's a mirror. Maybe there's something for me to see about myself. I've got this friend who's in this staff situation at a large church, and churches are volunteer organizations. In fact, I've heard of this in several settings, just recently working with some students at Bright Divinity School who are in some nonprofits. Nonprofits are sort of a hotbed of a lot of volunteerism, which means a lot of your self-extension, which means a lot of your baggage also goes into your work in a nonprofit. And it's passionate, it's honest, it's good, it's charitable, and yet that's what sometimes masks the stuff we bring to all these settings, just like sibling rivalry in our families, right? We don't realize all the stuff that's there until we're in the middle of it. Then we can't see past it. And so they get in these relationships that are kind of tense, and there's this arguing back and forth, and the feelings are hurt, and there's no way to see what's going on other than someone's hurting my feelings. What if there was possibility to approach every moment, positive or negative, as an opportunity to discover something about myself? Now here's the challenge, because already some will be going like, yeah, but what if they're really wrong? That's not the point, is it? Now, if you're seeing, if there's extreme violence, if there's cruelty, there's certain lines that you obviously have to look past. But in most of our relationships, it's not the point of who's right or who's wrong. That great line by Rumi, out beyond ideas of right and wrong, that's where I'll try to meet you there. That's what this is. It's inviting us to step beyond what we see, actually step back from what we think we see, and to ask the question, what else might be there? In the Thich Nhat, I'm going to pronounce his name wrong, Thich Nhat Hanh has this amazing quote that I've been playing around with my head this week. One of the ways in which we can begin to engage the strange is to treat it like it's sacred. To treat the moment like it's sacred. Now, here's one way you can do that. And then I'm going to give you a second way to do that. Thich Nhat Hanh says, treat what you're doing, the moment where you are. Be present to that. Do what you're doing as if you're bathing the Buddha or the baby Jesus. If you're washing a teapot, treat it as though it is the very child of God. If you're present in the moment, treat that moment as though you are present in the very presence with the holy, with God, with however you envision God. If you're with someone else and you're in an argument, step back for a moment and say, wait a minute, I'm having a fight with God here. I'm having a fight with something sacred here. I've forgotten to see it. Step back for a moment. And if you can't see it, step away from it for a moment. Just leave it because the patterns won't break free. Hans says, treat the moment as though that moment deserves every bit of your attention. You're washing your baby, you're not going to turn around. You're not going to step away. Every moment we have gives us that opportunity. And the second thing I want to suggest real quick is that you check out this book. It's a fun book. The book is called On Seeing. It's by Alexandra Horowitz. And it's just the obvious that she did. She's a New Yorker and a writer. The subtitle is 11 Walks Around the Block. Now, I'm somewhat poetic. As we've talked about in here, there are plumbers, poets, and prophets, in the church. And I'm somewhat more of the poet, and I want to be plumber. But I tend to sort of be often the visionary and kind of, detached from things. She says, when you walk around, be yourself and notice what you notice. But then bring in an expert. Now, she literally does this in the book. She brings in a botanist. She brings in an entomologist. She walks around the block with a zoologist. She walks around the block with a philosopher. She literally takes 11 walks around the same block in New York with an expert from the local university or from the zoo. And she gets their observations and is astounded by what she's missing with every single walk. Imagine if you could try to do that, even just for a casual practice on your own. What would a zoologist see here? What would a sociologist notice here? What would a theologian notice here? Or a philosopher? It requires that we have to get out of our routine, right? Get out of our norm, get out of our patterns, and see it from other eyes. Seeing things strange requires that we get out of ourselves. It's a deep practice. It can begin with silence. It can begin with just trying to pay attention. But realize the reality is even when we're paying attention, we're missing 75% of things. It's good to be silent, but we need new eyes sometimes. The final thing I'd want to say is, and this is probably the most obvious, is live life with gratitude. Now, this is the key. I see Facebook posts all the time, and I love them. There's beautiful Facebook posts of people say, I'm just so glad for today. I'm grateful. And I love that. I was with a friend this past weekend at this place where I was performing, and they hosted me. Her husband, Linda, and I were staying there. Her husband is the happiest, most positive guy I've ever met. If he says he's really mad, I think something has fallen apart in the world. I mean, the world is cracked open. He is just such a positive guy. And he's in his 70s, and he was a farmer growing up and then a professor. He's just the optimist. And he encourages everyone and loves everyone. He just walks around with this attitude. He's grateful. So I see that and I understand that. But here's the thing. It's more than just being grateful. It's taking the next step and just letting go of things. Gratitude is just giving things away, letting go of things, finding ways in which you can viscerally express the gratitude. That begins to change the neural patterns. Literally doing something that's expressive of gratitude. So try those 3 things this week, and maybe for the next couple of weeks even, and see if that doesn't begin to help you see things a little strange. And if you have one of those senior moments, like I've started having, where you literally see things strange because you forget where you are, or you're coming downtown and you're going like, have I been on this highway before? And you see it, well then take advantage of it. Seriously try to see what you've always known as something different, and invite yourself to stop making up your mind at the first opportunity, but instead see it as a mirror. What is the Holy saying? What is God's presence saying to me?